The year was 1879, and the world had frozen solid. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in sharp, angry hisses, coating the prairie in a shroud of white. At the edge of nowhere, a train station stood silent, a forgotten relic against the endless cold. The noon sun offered no warmth, only a harsh glare on the steel rails that stretched out toward towns where people still had hope. Here, there was no hope. Only the wind, a restless crow, and a woman on a bench. Her name was DeCessy Whitlock. For 3 days she had sat there, carved from ice and sorrow. She was a mail-order bride whose groom never showed. The letters had been filled with poetry and promises, but when the train pulled in, the platform remained empty. No one came for her. Now the station master looked right through her. Travelers whispered, their pity like daggers. Her small bag at her feet held everything she owned, a few faded dresses and a Bible worn soft with prayer. She had no home to return to. She was an orphan, abandoned first by God and now by man. On the third day, even the station cat gave up on her, disappearing into the cold. But DeCessy Whitlock just sat there, her shoulders squared, waiting for an end that had already come. A figure appeared down the road, a giant of a man moving through the snow. His steps were heavy, certain. Jacob Boone, a rancher built like the barns he raised with his own 2 hands. He was a man made of silence and hard edges, a man who had chosen work over words, distance over comfort. The land knew him, the town feared him. Behind his stony face was a hollowness, a gaping wound left by loss. His wife had been taken by the grave, leaving him with a daughter, a tiny flicker of light in his world of shadow. The little girl's hand was lost in his. Clara, 3 years old, with golden curls spilling from her bonnet and eyes that still looked for kindness in a cruel world. She trotted to keep up with his long strides, her gaze fixed on his face. Jacob said nothing. His silence wasn't cruel, it was armor. Armor against a world that had already taken too much. As they reached the desolate station, a small voice cut through the wind, a question so soft it almost wasn't there. "Dad," Clara whispered, "are we going to sleep without a mother again tonight?" The words were a blade, slipping right through the armor Jacob had spent years forging. He stopped. He looked down at his daughter and saw she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the woman on the bench, the woman who looked like she'd been forgotten by the entire world. Clara tugged his hand, her voice a fragile breath. "Can I call her Mama?" Jacob's jaw locked tight. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to protect the fragile world he had built for his daughter. But Clara's question hung in the air, a ghost he couldn't ignore. He turned his head, and his eyes met DeCessy's. She had been abandoned, shamed, left to freeze, but in her eyes, beneath the frost and the sorrow, was a flicker of steel, a strength that refused to be broken. She didn't look away, and in that moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding of survival. Then, before Jacob could move, before he could think, Clara let go of his hand. She toddled across the platform, her little boots crunching in the snow, straight toward the forgotten bride. DeCessy flinched, pulling her thin shawl tighter, expecting a cruel word, another look of pity. But the child just reached out and pressed a tiny, warm hand against the worn fabric of her dress. "Mama?" Clara asked again, her voice full of a child's unwavering certainty. A dam broke inside DeCessy. A wave of grief and despair she'd held back for 3 days finally crashed over her. Tears streamed down her frozen cheeks. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She just bent down and scooped the little girl into her arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing on earth. She buried her face in Clara's golden curls, forgetting the cold, forgetting the shame. Clara snuggled against her, and for the first time in days, a fragile smile touched DeCessy's lips. Jacob stood watching, a statue against the snow. Behind him, the whispers started again, carried on the wind. Boone's girl, clinging to that stranger, the poor bride, no one wanted her. He heard them. He felt their sting, not for himself, but for the woman holding his child. He took a step forward. His shadow fell over them. DeCessie looked up, her eyes wide with fear, expecting him to rip the child from her arms, to cast her back into the cold, but Jacob Boone said nothing. He simply held out his hand. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even a promise. It was a choice. Come with me, or stay here and die. DeCessie hesitated. The weight of her shame was a physical thing, holding her down. But then Clara's little arms tightened around her neck. A silent plea. With a trembling hand, DeCessie reached out and placed her fingers in his. His grip was like iron, steady and sure, a silent promise of something she couldn't yet name. Together, they rose from the bench. DeCessie held Clara tight against her shoulder, and the three of them turned their backs on the station. They walked away from the whispers, down the long white road leading to Boone's ranch. As they vanished into the swirling snow, the gossipers fell silent, watching the strange, broken family disappear. The ranch was as stark and silent as the man who owned it, a single cabin against an ocean of white. Jacob pushed the door open and gestured for her to enter. Inside, it smelled of pine and wood smoke. A fire glowed in the hearth. DeCessie moved on instinct, lowering Clara onto a quilt by the fire, hanging her own shawl to dry, warming a small pot of broth. She worked with a quiet desperation, her movements quick and efficient. She was a ghost in this house, trying to earn her right to exist. Jacob watched her from the shadows. He hadn't asked her name, she didn't know his, but she was already filling the empty spaces in his home, in his life, with a tenderness that felt foreign and dangerous. He saw the way she tucked a stray curl behind Clara's ear. He saw her lips tremble when she thought he wasn't looking, but the small warmth inside the cabin couldn't keep the cold world out. By morning, the news had spread through town like a fever. Boone took in the forsaken bride. At the mercantile, the women hid their smirks behind their hands. She'll play him for a fool. At the blacksmith, the men spat into the dirt. A giant like Boone brought low by a woman nobody else wanted. The words were like stones, and DeCessie felt every single one. She walked through town with her head down, her face burning with shame, clutching the coins Jacob had pressed into her hand. But when she returned to the ranch, broken and bruised by their cruelty, Clara would be waiting at the fence. "Mama!" The little girl would shriek with joy, running into her arms. The child's love was a balm, but the wound of her shame still festered beneath. Days turned into weeks. Jacob remained a man of few words, but he was always watching. He saw DeCessie rise before dawn to stoke the fire. He saw her mending Clara's clothes with meticulous stitches. He saw her work until her hands were raw, without a single word of complaint. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. She just endured. One night, the silence was broken by a weak cough. Clara was sick. A fever burned through her small body, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Jacob's heart. Before he could even move, DeCessie was there. She pressed cool cloths to Clara's forehead, her voice a low, soothing hum as she sang a cracked lullaby. All night she sat there, holding the child, refusing to rest, refusing to surrender. Jacob stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, watching this woman who had been thrown away by the world fight for his daughter's life as if it were her own. The wall around his heart, built of grief and silence, began to crack. This wasn't pity. It wasn't duty. It was something else. Something he thought had died with his wife. By dawn, the fever broke. Clara slept peacefully, her breathing steady. DeCessie was slumped in the chair beside the bed, exhausted, her face pale in the gray light. Jacob stepped forward and gently draped a blanket over her shoulders. His rough hand lingered for a second, a silent thank you before he pulled away. But something had changed. A thread had been woven between them in the darkness. Jacob Boone, the man who had chosen silence, stood on the edge of a new and terrifying world. And he wondered, not with words, but with a painful tightening in his chest, if he was ready for what came next. But as he looked at her, he realized something chilling. He knew why the whispers in town were so cruel. He knew why they looked at him with such hatred. It wasn't just about DeCessie. It was about his first wife. It was about the family she came from. The McAllisters, the most powerful, most ruthless family in the county. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they would not let this go. They would see DeCessie not as a godsend but as an insult, a replacement. And the McAllisters were not known for their forgiveness. They were known for their vengeance. The quiet life he had found with DeCessie was about to be shattered. The whispers were just the beginning. A storm was coming, far worse than any blizzard, and it was heading straight for his door. Winter tightened its grip, but inside the small cabin, a fragile warmth had begun to grow. Clara's laughter, a sound Jacob hadn't heard in years, echoed off the timber walls. It was DeCessie who coaxed it out of her, with quiet songs and gentle games. Jacob found himself listening, his hands stilling in his work, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. But outside those four walls, the world was sharpening its knives. The town, spurred on by the whispers of the McAllister clan, had declared war. When DeCessie went to the mercantile, the owner would suddenly be out of flour. The blacksmith would ignore her, letting her stand in the cold for an hour before telling her he was too busy to sell her nails. They were trying to starve them out, to freeze them out, to break them. It was Martha McAllister, Jacob's former mother-in-law, who led the charge, a woman carved from granite and spite. She saw DeCessie in the street one day and stopped, her eyes like chips of ice. "Some strays," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "are better left in the snow. They carry diseases." DeCessie flinched, but she didn't run. She met the old woman's gaze, her chin held high, and walked away. But the words followed her, clinging to her like frost. Jacob saw the toll it was taking. He saw the quiet dignity with which she bore their hatred and the strength it took for her to face them day after day. He started leaving small things for her by the fire, a piece of wood carved into a bird for Clara, a new ribbon for her hair he'd traded for. He never said a word. He didn't have to. The gestures were enough. "I see you." One night, after Clara was asleep, DeCessie finally spoke of the life she'd left behind. "I waited 3 days at that station," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I started to think it would be a mercy to just lie down in the snow, to let it cover me." She looked at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I never imagined being wanted. Not really." Jacob didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were trapped behind a wall of grief and secrets. He simply reached across the table and laid his hand palm up, a few inches from hers. An invitation. An offering. A silent promise that she wasn't alone in the dark. It was then that he noticed something odd. The Bible she kept on the small table by her bed. It was the one thing she'd brought with her, worn and familiar. But tonight, it was different. It was lying open, and a corner of something was sticking out from between the pages. A piece of paper that didn't belong. He waited until she was asleep, the exhaustion of her daily battles finally claiming her. He moved silently across the room, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know why, but a cold dread washed over him. He gently pulled the paper from the pages of Genesis. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't a note, it was a photograph, a faded, sepia-toned image of 2 men standing side by side, smiling for the camera. One of the men was younger, his face full of hope and ambition. The man who was supposed to be her husband. The other man was Jacob Boone. But that wasn't the twist. That wasn't the secret that made the blood freeze in his veins. The man she was supposed to marry, the man in the photograph standing next to him, was his brother. Silas. The brother who had vanished without a trace 6 months ago. The brother Jacob had told everyone had run off to California to chase gold, the brother who was, in fact, buried in an unmarked grave on the far side of the ranch. DeCessie hadn't been abandoned by a stranger, she had been promised to his dead brother, and she had no idea. The silence in the cabin was suddenly suffocating. Jacob stared at the photograph, the smiling faces of 2 brothers, one dead, One a liar. He had brought this woman into his home under a false pretense, a lie of omission that was now a ticking bomb. He had let her believe her groom was a coward who had simply left her at the station. The truth was so much worse. Silas hadn't run away. He had been murdered, and Jacob knew who did it. He had known from the moment he found his brother's body, a bullet hole in his back, lying in the snow near the border of their land, the border that connected their property to the vast, sprawling empire of the McAllister family. He hadn't gone to the sheriff because the sheriff was a McAllister cousin. He hadn't told anyone because in this town, a Boone's word against a McAllister's was worth less than nothing. So he had buried his brother, told a lie to the world, and begun a slow, silent hunt for justice. Or revenge. He wasn't sure which anymore. He looked over at DeCessy, sleeping peacefully, and a wave of guilt washed over him. He had used her. He had seen her at the station. A convenient solution to his problem of needing a mother for Clara, a cover for his grief and his rage. He had brought her into this hornet's nest without a word of warning. He was no better than the McAllisters. He was a liar and a coward. He carefully slid the photograph back into the Bible, his mind racing. What would she do if she found out? Would she run? Would she go to the sheriff and expose him? He couldn't risk it. Not now. Not when he was so close to finding the proof he needed to destroy the McAllisters once and for all. He had to keep her in the dark, for her own safety, for his. He turned back to the fire, the secret a heavy weight in his gut. But as he stared into the flames, another, more terrifying thought occurred to him. Why did she have this photograph? Silas had sent for her, yes, but why would he have sent her a picture of the two of them? Unless Silas had told her about him, unless she knew exactly who Jacob was from the very beginning. The thought was a punch to the gut. Had she been playing him this whole time? Was this quiet, gentle woman not a victim, but a player in a game he didn't understand? Was she working with the McAllisters? Had they sent her to spy on him, to find out what he knew about Silas's death? The trust he had begun to feel curdled into suspicion. The fragile warmth in the cabin turned to ice. He looked at her again, this woman sleeping in his brother's intended bed, and he no longer saw a survivor. He saw a threat. The storm hit without warning. A wall of white descended on the prairie, the wind howling like a demon. Snow piled up against the cabin, rattling the windows, trying to claw its way inside. It was the perfect cover. For what, Jacob wasn't sure, but he felt it in his bones. Something was coming. His suspicion of DeCessy gnawed at him. He watched her every move, searching for a sign, a slip-up, but she was exactly as she had always been. Quiet, kind, attentive to Clara. Her gentle nature was a perfect mask, if it was a mask. The uncertainty was driving him mad. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them in the suffocating silence of the cabin. On the third night, Clara's fever returned, worse than before. Her small body was on fire, her breathing ragged. DeCessy worked tirelessly, her face a mask of worry, using her knowledge of herbs and remedies to fight the sickness. Jacob watched, torn between gratitude and distrust. Was this real, or was this part of the act? Just as the fever seemed to be at its peak, there was a loud banging on the door. It wasn't the wind, it was a fist. Jacob grabbed his rifle from above the mantelpiece. He cracked the door open. Standing in the swirling snow were 3 figures, hunched against the blizzard. It was Sheriff Miller, and behind him, 2 of the McAllister brothers, their faces red with cold and whiskey. "Boone!" the sheriff yelled over the wind. "Martha sent us. She's worried about the child." "The child is fine," Jacob said, blocking the doorway with his massive frame. "Martha has a court order," the sheriff said, holding up a piece of paper. "Emergency custody. She says you're keeping the girl in an unsafe environment. With her." He jerked his head toward DeCessy, who was holding a terrified Clara in her arms. "She says this woman is a danger to the child." It was a lie, a fabrication. But the piece of paper in the sheriff's hand made it the law. They were using the storm, using Clara's illness to take her away from him. It was a checkmate. DeCessy's face went white. She clutched Clara tighter, her eyes pleading with Jacob. "I won't let you," Jacob growled, his hand tightening on the rifle. "Don't be a fool, Boone," the sheriff warned, his own hand drifting to the pistol on his hip. "It's 3 against 1. Give us the girl." In that moment, something inside Jacob snapped. The silence, the secrets, the slow-burning rage. It all erupted. He wasn't going to lose his daughter. He wasn't going to lose anything else. But he knew he couldn't win with violence. Not against the law, corrupt as it was. He had to use the one weapon they didn't expect. The truth. "You want to know what's unsafe, Sheriff?" Jacob's voice was low, dangerous. "My brother, Silas. He sent for this woman. He was going to marry her, but he never made it to the station because your cousins, the McAllisters, put a bullet in his back." The sheriff's face paled. The McAllister brothers shifted uncomfortably. "That's a damn lie, Boone," one of them snarled. "Is it?" Jacob said, his eyes burning with an intensity that made them all take a step back. "He found gold on the land your father has been trying to steal from my family for 20 years. He had the claim papers, and then he disappeared. You tell me what happened." The bluff was audacious. He had no proof, nothing but his own conviction. He was betting everything on their guilt, on the hope that the truth would be enough to make them hesitate. The sheriff looked from Jacob to the McAllister brothers, his face a mess of confusion and fear. He had walked into a war he didn't understand. And then DeCessie spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the howling wind like a razor. "He's telling the truth," she said. She walked forward, standing beside Jacob, no longer the timid, shamed woman from the station. "Silas wrote to me. He told me he was in danger. He told me if anything happened to him, the McAllisters were responsible." It was a lie, a brilliant, stunning lie. Silas had never written any such thing. But she had seen the photograph. She had pieced together the whispers and the hatred. She had chosen a side. She had chosen his. The sheriff was stunned into silence. A court order for custody was one thing. A direct accusation of murder against the most powerful family in the county was another. He was out of his depth. He looked at the McAllister boys, whose blustering confidence had vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. He looked at Jacob and DeCessie standing united, their faces set like stone. He made a decision. "This is beyond me," he stammered, lowering his hand from his gun. "We'll sort this out when the storm passes." He turned and trudged back into the blizzard, the McAllisters reluctantly following, casting hateful glares back at the cabin. The door slammed shut, leaving Jacob and DeCessie alone in the sudden quiet, the sound of their own breathing loud in the small room. He turned to her, his mind reeling. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did you do that?" DeCessie looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. "Because Clara called me Mama," she said simply. "And mothers protect their children." The wall around Jacob's heart didn't just crack, it crumbled into dust. This woman, this stranger he had used and suspected, had just risked everything for him, for his daughter. He had been so wrong. The guilt was a physical pain. "There's more," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's worse than you think." He walked over to the loose floorboard beneath his bed, the place where he kept his secrets. He pulled it up and took out a small, leather-bound journal. Silas's journal. "The proof isn't just about gold," he said, his voice heavy with a truth he had never spoken aloud. "It's about my wife, Clara's mother." He opened the journal. "She was a McAllister, and she was helping them. She helped them kill my brother." The confession hung in the air, a devastating blow. DeCessie stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the layers of betrayal. Jacob's wife? A murderer? The McAllister family's wickedness ran deeper than she could have ever imagined. Silas's journal laid it all bare. His excitement about the gold discovery, his growing suspicion of his neighbors. And then, the final, frantic entry. He had confronted Jacob's wife, Sarah. He had discovered she was feeding information to her father, helping him prepare a legal challenge to steal the claim. In his entry, Silas wrote that Sarah had panicked, begged him not to tell Jacob. The entry ended there. "I found him the next morning," Jacob said, his voice hollow. "Sarah told me he'd run off to California. I believed her. For a week." He swallowed hard, the memory still raw. "Then I found the journal. I confronted her. She confessed everything. She hadn't meant to kill him. They argued. She had a gun. It just went off. She was terrified. Of me. Of her father. The stress. The guilt. It sent her into early labor. Clara was born that night. Sarah. She didn't survive. The silence that followed was profound. The howling of the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest inside the cabin. DeCessi finally understood the depth of Jacob's silence, the armor he wore. It wasn't just grief. It was the weight of an impossible secret. He was protecting his wife's memory for the sake of his daughter, while simultaneously hating the family responsible for it all. "Her family never knew," Jacob continued, his gaze lost in the fire. "They blame me for her death. They think I worked her too hard, that this land killed her. They want Clara because she's the last piece of their daughter they have left, and because she's the heir to the land with the gold." He finally looked at DeCessi, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate plea. "I brought you into this. I used you as a shield. I'm sorry." Before she could respond, the cabin door burst open, splintering off its hinges. Old man McAllister stood there, his face purple with rage, a shotgun in his hands. His sons and the sheriff were behind him, their faces grim. The temporary truce was over. "You'll not slander my daughter's name, Boone," McAllister roared, his voice shaking with fury. "And you'll not keep my granddaughter. Sheriff, arrest this man for the murder of his wife." The accusation was insane, a desperate, last-ditch effort to seize control. The sheriff, a weak man caught between two titans, looked uncertain, but McAllister was the one who signed his paychecks. He drew his pistol. "Jacob Boone, you're under arrest." But as he stepped forward, DeCessi moved. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She walked calmly to the fireplace, picked up the iron poker, and stood between Jacob and the law. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "You will listen." She turned her gaze on McAllister, her eyes blazing. "You speak of your daughter's name, but you know nothing of her heart. She was trapped between a husband she loved and a father she feared. Your greed pushed her to do something terrible. Your greed killed her, just as surely as it killed Silas Boone." She held up the journal. "This is the truth, in Silas's own hand, and in Sarah's." She wrote a final letter to Jacob. "It's all here. Read it, and then speak of slander." She had been bluffing before, but Jacob realized, with a jolt, that she must have found Sarah's letter, tucked away with the journal he had hidden. McAllister stared at the journal, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. The story he had told himself for years, the story of the cruel husband and the victim daughter, was crumbling before his eyes. The sheriff lowered his gun. This was no longer a simple matter of custody. This was a nest of snakes, and he wanted no part of it. "Put the gun down, Mr. McAllister," the sheriff said, his voice firm for the first time. "It's over." McAllister looked at Jacob, then at DeCessi, then at the small child cowering behind them. The fight went out of him. The rage was replaced by a sudden, crushing wave of grief. His daughter, his legacy, all of it was a lie, stained by blood and greed. He dropped the shotgun with a clatter and stumbled out into the storm, a broken man. His sons, their faces pale and drawn, followed him into the white chaos. The storm inside the cabin had finally broken. The aftermath was a fragile, uncertain peace. The world outside was still frozen, but the secrets that had held them captive had been thawed by the fire of truth. The sheriff, looking ashamed and exhausted, simply nodded at Jacob and left, closing the broken door behind him. They were alone, just the three of them. Jacob looked at DeCessi, this woman who had been a stranger just weeks ago, who had faced down his demons and saved his family. Words were inadequate. He simply walked to her and took the journal from her hands. He tossed it into the fire. They watched it burn, the pages curling into ash, taking the ghosts of the past with them. "It's done," he said. "The land is safe. Clara is safe. And you?" she asked softly. He struggled for the words. "I've been living in a tomb of my own making. You walked in and smashed the door down." He reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Thank you." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of relief, of belonging. She had arrived at this desolate place with nothing, expecting nothing. And in the heart of a blizzard, in the center of a feud, she had found everything she had ever wanted: a child to love, a man to stand beside, a home. As the fire crackled, and Clara, finally safe, drifted to sleep in her arms, DeCessie knew her journey was over. She wasn't a forsaken bride anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. When spring finally came, melting the snow and turning the prairie green, Jacob saddled the wagon. He took DeCessie and Clara into town. But this time, they didn't go to the Mercantile. They went to the small chapel at the edge of town. The townspeople watched, their faces a mixture of awe and respect. The story of that night in the storm had become a legend: the silent giant who had spoken thunder, and the forsaken bride who had become a lioness. The preacher's words were simple. The vows were spoken in quiet, steady voices. The humble rings they exchanged shone like gold in the sunlight streaming through the windows. As they stepped outside, man and wife, DeCessie lifted her chin high. The shame was gone, washed away by truth and love. Jacob, who had once been a man of only silence, had found his voice. He had discovered that love wasn't a weakness, but the most profound strength of all. That evening, they stood at the fence of their ranch, watching the sun set in a blaze of purple and orange. Clara, sleepy and content, was nestled in Jacob's arms. She looked at DeCessie and whispered that one perfect word. "Mama." DeCessie leaned her head against Jacob's shoulder, a quiet joy filling her heart. The silence that had once filled this land was gone, replaced by the sound of a family. A family forged in a storm, built on the ashes of the past, and stronger than any winter. The whispers of the prairie are different now. They don't speak of sorrow or vengeance. They tell a story of how a broken man and a forgotten woman, brought together by a child's hope, found a home in each other's hearts. If you were moved by this story of survival and justice on the frontier, don't forget to subscribe. There are always more secrets buried just beneath the snow.